Hi everyone, this is Subdivision Surface exercise number 4, and in this video we're going to be modeling this shader ball here, which is based on an object done by an artist called Grant Warwick. So this was my general guide to modeling my own shader ball. And this shader ball here wasn't done in a polygon modeling application, it was done in CAD software. So I wanted to try and find out if I could pull off something similar in Cinema 4D using subdivision surfaces, and this was my result. I have prepared a project folder for you with a couple of Cinema 4D files. We're going to start with the Cinema 4D shader ball start file, and I've made a render of my shader ball that we're going to be using as a reference from time to time, and I have scaled the reference image so it fits the size of a standard sphere, which has a radius of 100 centimeters. For now, we're not going to need this reference image, so I'm just going to switch it off. The trickiest part about doing this shader ball was trying to get that triangular hole into the sphere, and I ended up not using a sphere as a starting point but a cube. And eventually we're going to end up with geometry that is very similar to a hexahedron, at least at the top. We're going to have to change the bottom of that geometry quite a bit. And starting with a cube made things a lot easier. So I'm going to delete the sphere and add a cube to the scene. We need some segments for the cube. And at this point we have to make a very important decision, because the number of segments will have an effect on a couple of things, like the size of the hole, and it will also have an effect on how round or how sharp the corners of this triangular hole will be. In order to get sharp corners like you have on Grant Warwick's shader ball, you'd have to use a lot more geometry to be able to pull that off with subdivision surfaces on a curved surface. Another effect the number of segments we choose will have is how much detail we can add at the base of the shader ball. And if I use 4 segments, like on this cube, I will not be able to add as many cutouts at the bottom here. It will only give me enough geometry to add 6 of these cutouts, and I wanted 8 of these cutouts for the base of the shader ball. So I ended up using 6 segments for the cube, and that's pretty much perfect because it allows me to add the detail that I want at the base of the shader ball, and also it's still low poly enough so we can easily manipulate the geometry, at least in the first stages of the modeling process. I'm going to make this cube editable by hitting C on the keyboard, and because our shader ball is symmetrical, we can get rid of half of it right away. In order to create that hole, I'm going to use the line cut tool and make 2 cuts like this. And then I can select these 5 points here and delete them. And that will give us the hole that we need. And we can put this in a symmetry object. And we can also add a spherify deformer as a child of the symmetry, and we're going to use this spherify deformer a number of times, and I'm always going to use the same settings for it, which is 100 for the radius, which is the size of a standard sphere, and we're going to increase the strength to 100%. And if I add a subdivision surface object on top of it, we will get pretty much the hole that we want. Because essentially our object still is a cube, it is very easy to change the geometry. For example, I could select the cube, and if I go to my top view, let's say I want this line from the bottom corner to the top corner to be more straight. Right now it's kind of making this curve. I could just select this point down here and move it straight over without having to worry about changing the shape of the sphere, because it's still a cube and we can move points left to right without screwing up the spherical shape. We could also move this point over a little bit to get a straighter line like this. With these modifications we can now select the symmetry object and use current state to object, delete the original, and we have our basic sphere. And as you can see, we still have some triangles. We are going to get rid of those. And I also want to add the control edges for the hole, which is what I'm going to do first. So let's go to edge mode, and I'm going to select the edges around that hole. And maybe I'll also create a material, switch off reflectance and make the color a lot darker. And that's just so you can see a little bit better what's going on in my viewport. So with these edges selected, we can now use the slide tool, hold down Control to clone the edges, and let's move them about, let's say, 3.5 centimeters. And you can see we've created these holes here. I'm going to close them by selecting these points and then using the weld tool. Just left click anywhere in the viewport to weld the points together, and down here I'm going to weld these 2 points to this one down here, and these ones I'm just going to left click in the viewport and then use the slide tool to slightly adjust the position of this point here. Maybe we could move this one down a bit as well to follow this line here. In order to get rid of the triangle and the n-gon up here, I'm going to use the line cut tool, and I'm going to continue this edge here by making another cut. And now we can select this edge and we can melt it to get rid of it. And I'm going to make another cut like this. And now we can dissolve this edge here, which will give us quads everywhere here. And I'm going to slide this point over a little bit to about here maybe. In order to get rid of this triangle here, we have to add a couple of edges. So let's grab the line cut tool again. I'm going to switch off single line here, and I'm going to make cuts like this. And now we can dissolve this edge here. Maybe slide this point over a bit, and down here I'm going to delete this point and weld these 2 points together and use the slide tool again to adjust the position a little bit. So I think that's looking pretty good for now. We've gotten rid of all of the triangles and n-gons, so the geometry is clean. It will not yet look pretty clean when we subdivide it because we don't have enough geometry yet to make the border of the hole really look clean. And I'll show you what I mean just in a second. First of all, let's get another symmetry object, and I'm going to add another spherify deformer with the same settings as before. So 100 for the radius, 100 for the strength. Let's use current state to object, delete the original, and I'll just add another symmetry object, switch on the subdivision surface object, and if I get rid of this material and render this, you can see we have this nasty little bump going around that hole. And in order to get rid of that, we really have to add more geometry. So what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to maybe slide this point over a little bit further. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the subdivision surface object to add more geometry to that sphere. And I want to convert this object with a setting of 1 for the subdivisions. Now we have to change the subdivision renderer to 1 as well, because that is what Cinema 4D will use to convert the object. So with these settings we can make the subdivision surface object editable. And I'm going to use a spherify deformer once again. Change the radius and the strength to 100. And use current state to object. And now if we subdivide this, our sphere will look a lot cleaner. And you can see that the mesh is looking really nice too. We have the geometry flowing very nicely around that hole here. One thing we could do in order to reduce the polygon count a little bit is we could get rid of these edges here. We don't really need these. So let's go ahead and dissolve them. And just in case, I'm going to add another Spherify deformer with the same settings as before and use current state to object when I'm done. Next I want to extrude the base of the shader ball. And you can see the base is circular, and that's a bit of a problem because we don't really have the geometry down here to be able to create a circular shape, which means we have to change a couple of things to make that possible. Which means we have to make a couple of changes to make it possible to get the circular shape that we want. I'm just going to put that material back on there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these edges here, and you can see this kind of diamond-shaped polygon here. I'm going to select the edges surrounding the diamond-shaped polygon. Let's go around the object and select some more edges here. So now I can hit UF, and I can now select these polygons down here and delete them. And whenever we delete polygons, we should make sure to optimize the object to get rid of all of the points that are left. I'm going to deselect everything and optimize the shader ball. Now let's go back to edge mode, and I'm going to scale these edges to 0, and I'm going to move them down a little bit, trying to follow the shape of the sphere here. And that seems to look pretty good, but if I render it, you can see we're getting these creases at the corners, and that's because we don't really have a circular shape here. In order to change that, I'm going to add a disk, and I'm going to move this down a little bit and maybe make it a little bit smaller. We only need one disk segment here. If I select my shader ball, you can see I have these edges down here selected, and it's 48 edges, which means we have to use 48 rotation segments for the disk. And now we can select both of these objects and use connect objects and delete. I'm also going to select the edges of the disk down here, and now I can use stitch and sew, hold down the shift key, left click and drag to connect the geometry. And now we can select these edges and dissolve them, and that will give us our circular shape at the bottom. Let's select these edges here and move them up, and we still have the surface of the disk down here. I'm going to get rid of that by deleting this point at the bottom. Let's move these edges up a bit further and scale them down. And again, I'm trying to follow the shape of the sphere. And if I render this now, you can see this looks a lot cleaner. We still have one problem though. And that is the fact that the geometry is not distributed very evenly. And you can get away with it. It kind of looks okay. If I get rid of this material, it may become more obvious. So we're getting kind of this bumpy line following these edges down here. So that's the next thing I want to change. The only thing we can do really is slide the points around and try to even out the geometry, and that's very tedious work. Now, fortunately for me, I have a plugin called the HB Modeling Bundle, which is a collection of scripts for modeling mainly. So I'm going to use one of the scripts of the HB Modeling Bundle, which is called Even Distribution, to change the geometry and make it more even. If you don't have that plugin and if you don't want to buy it, don't worry about it. You will find an additional Cinema 4D file in the project folder with the result of the modifications, and you can use that to continue the tutorial. So first of all, I'm going to delete half of the object, and then I'm going to select 4 edges like this, and I'm going to use Alt-D to switch off the axis. And now I'm going to use that script, and I have it mapped to a hotkey, so I can do this fairly quickly. And if I use that hotkey, it evens out the edges here. And I'm going to continue doing this to make the geometry more even down here. So you can see the script really makes short work of a tedious task like this. So we're done, and this is looking a lot better. I'm going to add another symmetry object now, and I'll make this editable. And I'm going to use a Spherify deformer one more time. And then use current state to object to convert it. Let's get rid of these tags, we don't really need these. And then I'm going to select these points at the bottom here and scale them down to even these out. And next I'm going to switch the reference image back on. We can now move our shader ball up and line it up with the reference image. Okay, something like this. It's not a perfect fit, but that's fine. And now we can start to extrude the base. So in edge mode, I'm going to select the edges here at the bottom, and I'm going to extrude them straight down a little bit. Extrude again to about here. And then scale these edges out, and maybe I'll move these up a little bit further. I'm going to extrude these edges down again, scale them, and extrude them down again to about here. In order to sharpen this corner here, I'm going to ring select these edges and then use edge cut with one subdivision, and I'm going to slide this edge loop up to about here. And if I subdivide this, it's going to look something like this. Before I start adding the cutouts here at the bottom, I'm going to add some depth to that hole. So let's select these edges here, and I'm going to hit D for extrude, and I'm going to extrude these edges with an edge angle, and we can either use a positive 90 degrees and use a negative offset, or we can use negative 90 degrees and a positive offset. So if I hit apply with these settings here, the edges are going to be extruded to the inside of the sphere. And let's make this a little bit deeper. Let's do maybe 10 or 11. And I'm going to hit new transform, so we're getting some geometry here on the inside. And now we can select these edges here and use the bevel tool. I'm going to do a solid bevel here, and let's do maybe 2.5. And I'm going to ring select these edges and use edge cut to create another edge loop like this. So this is looking pretty good, and you can see that the edges are looking very clean. We don't have any bumps in the geometry. That is looking pretty nice. If I select the edges down here at the bottom, you can see we have 48 edges, and I want 8 of the cutouts here at the base. So we have to divide 48 by 8, which is 6, which means that we need 6 polygons for each of the cutouts that we're going to add. So let's go ahead and select 3 polygons to the left or to the right of the center. I'm also going to select these polygons down here, and I'm going to split them off to create a new object. Let's make this one invisible for now, and we can add a symmetry object, and let's put a subdivision surface object on top of it. I'm going to switch off these 2 for now. In order to create that cutout, I'm going to select these edges here and then use the slide tool, hold down Control to clone the edges to about the center of this polygon. And I'm going to switch on preserve curvature so we can follow the curve down here a little better. In order to make this round, I'm going to slide some points around. So I'm going to move this one up a bit, and let's go ahead and move this one down quite a bit. We can only really see how this looks if we delete these points down here to create that hole. Let's have a look. So I think that's looking pretty good. Next, I'm going to select these 3 edges here, extrude them down a bit, scale them to 0, and then let's use axis extension. So I'm going to switch on snapping, go to my move tool, right click on the y-axis, snap it to these edges, left click and snap them to this point down here. If I go to point mode, deselect everything and optimize, we should see 1 point disappear here. So optimize, and we have 16 points, which means the corner here has been welded. Before I start adding the control edges, I'm going to change the geometry a little bit. We do have all quads here, but if I subdivide this, it's going to look like this. I'm just going to make a copy, and let's move this over a bit. So what I'm going to do in order to make the geometry look a little bit nicer is I'm going to select these 2 edges here, then use edge cut with 2 subdivisions, and now I can use the line cut tool to make a cut like this, and we can now dissolve these edges here. Select this one, slide it up a little bit, and let's select this one and slide it up a little bit as well. So if I subdivide this, you can see we're getting a much more even and nicer looking mesh. I also want a bit of a lip down here, so we can add some control edges and add some depth to the object. So let's go ahead and select these edges here. I'm going to extrude them with the same settings as before, but 11 is a bit much, so let's bring this down to about 4. And if I switch on the symmetry, you can see we're getting a bit of a gap here. We could just move this point over to 0 on the x-axis, but it will probably change the width of these polygons a little bit. So if you want to be more accurate, you could select this edge here, extrude it over like this. And then we could use the line cut tool to make a cut from this point here straight to the back. Delete these 2 points and just weld these points to this one. So now if I switch on the symmetry, we don't have this gap anymore, and we've made sure that we keep an even width for these polygons. So let's go ahead and add the control edges. I'm going to start here at the bottom by selecting these edges and doing a solid bevel. And let's do maybe, let's try 2. Well, that's a bit much. So 1 should be fine. And next I'm going to select these edges here. And again use a solid bevel. And this one I'm going to make a little bit wider, maybe 1.5 or so. And you can see we're creating a little bit of a mess down here. And I guess it's just easier to deselect these edges for now and then do a solid bevel. And I'm going to switch the mitering to uniform to get rid of the issue up here. And then we can just select these 2 points and weld them. And let's use the line cut tool to make 2 cuts like this. And dissolve these 2 edges here. We also have to sharpen this corner here, so let's do another solid bevel. And again, I'm using an offset of 1.5, and this will create this n-gon here. And what we can do to get rid of that is select these edges and use connect points edges. I'm going to select them, scale them, and then use axis extension to line them up with this point here. And now we can select these 2 points and connect them. And we still have an n-gon up here. Now we could continue adding edges here, but eventually we would end up with geometry like this. Let me just select these edges and scale them down. So we would still have a triangle here. And we don't really want that because it's on a curved surface. And one way to get rid of this triangle would be to connect these edges. And now we have a 4-sided polygon here. It's not a very good 4-sided polygon though, because we have 3 points lined up like this. And what I would do to change that is slide this point over. So we're getting this kind of topology, and it looks good, but the problem is that if I rotate the camera around, the problem is that we're getting this non-planar polygon, which means that this point here is not in the same plane as the other points. And on a surface like this, if I subdivide this, you can see we're getting a bump here. So we need to try and do this differently in order to avoid this problem. So let's go back a few steps. Instead of adding more edges here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these edges here and connect them. And then I'm going to select these edges and just slide them over to about here. And now we can connect these 2 points. And down here I'm going to make a cut like this. So if I subdivide this, we won't be getting that bump on this surface here. The only problem we still have is that these points over here are very far apart. So if I subdivide, you can see the edges get pulled away from the corner quite a bit, which makes the edge or the corner up here a lot softer. I'm not going to change that, but if you want to change it, you would have to add more geometry. So you could introduce another edge loop that goes around here, in order to make sure that this edge here stays in place when you subdivide the object. But in this case, I've decided that I can live with the geometry as it is in order not to create too many polygons. If you want to change that, feel free to add more edges and make that corner more even. Maybe I'll move this point down a little bit further. And I'm also going to slide this edge up a little bit further, and this one as well. So now we can start to copy this object around, and I'm going to use a cloner for that. Switch the mode to radial, the plane to XZ. We don't need any radius, so let's enter 0 here, and we need 8 copies. And that's looking good, but if you rotate the camera, you can see that we have overlapping geometry here. I'm going to fix that by putting the cloner in a connect object. And for the connect object, I'm going to increase the tolerance a bit. So let's bring this up a little bit, and you can see these points are getting welded together here. Now down here the distance is a bit too big, and if I increase the tolerance too much, other points will be welded together as well. So what I'm going to do in order to avoid that is I'm going to select the disk, go to point mode, and use the slide tool to slide this point over until the connect object welds them together. I guess we could move this one over a little bit as well if we wanted to, just to get a straighter line here. So that's looking pretty good. Now we can make the connect object editable. It will also weld the points at the seams. And if I subdivide this, we're getting a pretty nice looking result. And you can see the edges up here are a little bit softer. But like I said before, in this case I've decided to leave it as it is. It's not looking too bad, and if you zoom out, I think some of the edges are almost a bit too sharp for my taste. But overall it's looking pretty good. So now we can connect this base to the shader ball. And in order to be able to do that, I'm going to use the loop selection and select these polygons here, and I'm going to delete them. Make sure to optimize the object, and we can now use connect objects and delete to turn this into a single piece of geometry. And let's select these edges here and these ones, and I'm going to use stitch and sew to connect the geometry like this. And if we subdivide this, we're getting a result like this, which I think looks pretty nice. The last thing I want to do before we start creating the platform for the shader ball is I'm going to add a sphere. I'm going to move it up. So this will be the inside of our shader ball. Let's move it to about here. And we need to scale this down a little bit. And then just move it around. Maybe scale it up a little bit further. Something like this. And I'm going to add a couple of segments. Let's do maybe 48. I'm going to make this a child of our shader ball. So something like this, it makes the geometry look consistent. And this is the finished top of our shader ball. So the result we got is looking pretty nice. We have all quads, we have pretty good geometry that flows very nicely, especially around the whole of the shader ball. So now we can continue and model the platform for the shader ball. In order to model the platform for the shader ball, we can start with a simple cylinder. First of all, I'm going to rename this object here to shader ball, and let's hide it. And I'm going to add a cylinder. Let's change the radius to 130. And as for the rotation segments, I'm going to use quite a few here because I want to make sure that when I add the control edges to sharpen these corners, the geometry on this curved surface stays clean. And it will be cleaner the more subdivisions or rotation segments we use for that cylinder. In this case, I'm going for 60 rotation segments. Let's make the cylinder editable and optimize it to weld the caps to the walls. And in model mode, I'm going to bring up axis center and move the axis to the bottom of the cylinder, and then move the cylinder to the floor. And now we can select these points here and move them down to about here. And before I scale them to match the shape of the platform, we have to add another edge loop down here to make sure that this section stays straight. So I'm going to ring select these edges here and just connect them. Select the edges and move them down to about here. And now I can scale these points like so, and let's go ahead and use even numbers. So I'll do 200 by 200 for the top. Next, I'm going to select the polygons at the bottom, use I for inner extrude, and extrude them like so. Delete these polygons, optimize the object. And up here, I'm going to loop select the top polygons, do another inner extrusion, and I'll make this maybe 8 centimeters. And I'm going to extrude these polygons down 10 centimeters. I already know that I will need an additional edge close to this corner here. So I'm going to use extrude inner again and create a polygon loop like this. And let's use extrude inner one more time and delete these polygons at the center. And this hole will be covered by the shader ball later, so we don't have to create all of that extra geometry at the center of this surface here. Next, we'll have to create some additional edge loops on this slanted surface here. So I'm going to ring select these edges and use the plane cut tool. Switch the mode to world. The plane has to be XY so we can make a horizontal cut, and let's switch on snapping. I'm going to snap the plane cut tool to this edge here to make sure it's at the same height as this surface up here. And we need 2 more edge loops here and here. And now we can go ahead and create the cutouts here at the front. In the top view, I'm going to select 8 polygons to the right of the center, and let's add 8 more on the other side, so we have 16 polygons selected here. And now we can also select these ones and these ones here at the back and delete them, optimize the object. And now we can select these edges here and these ones, and then use stitch and sew, hold down shift, left click and drag to close this hole here, and I'm going to use close polygon hole to add the polygons here. Now we can ring select these edges and connect them, and then select these edges here and delete them. Select these edges, extrude them down a bit, switch on snapping, and I'll switch off the reference image again. And we need to snap these edges down to this edge. And now we can select these edges here, and again use stitch and sew to create these polygons, and close polygon hole to close these holes here. The last cutout we need is this small cutout here, and for this one I'm going to select these 6 polygons here at the center, and I'll make a cut straight across these polygons like this. I forgot one, so let's try that again. And now I can select these edges here and delete them, select these edges and extrude them down, and use snapping to snap them to these edges here. And once again I'm using stitch and sew to create the polygons here, and I'm going to close the holes here. So that's not looking too bad. Next we're going to add the control edges, and we only have to do this on 1/2 of the object. So I'm going to delete this half here, optimize again, let's go to edge mode, deselect everything, and then I'm going to do a func break selection, select all of these edges and use the bevel tool. I'm going to do a solid bevel, and maybe I'll make these edges a little bit softer, and I'm going to change the mithering back to default. It will look a little bit messier than uniform, but it gives me a lot of the edges that I would otherwise have to create manually, so I'm going to stick with the default here. So now we can start and fix the geometry where it needs fixing. We're going to start with this corner here, and I'm going to use the line cut tool to make 3 cuts like this. And now we can dissolve the edges that we don't need. If I subdivide this, you can see we're getting a bit of distortion here. That's because we don't have enough geometry in this area. So I'm going to loop select or ring select these edges, and then use edge cut and add a couple of subdivisions, and this will look a lot cleaner. Now let's continue with this corner here. I'm going to make 3 more cuts like this, and over here I'm going to cut over to about here, and that means we can get rid of this entire edge loop up here. So let's dissolve these edges. We can also dissolve these 2 ones and these ones over here. And up here we've created an n-gon. I'm going to get rid of that by selecting these edges here. And then using edge cut with 1 subdivision. So let's move on to this edge down here, or this corner down here. Same procedure as before. We'll add 3 cuts like this to sharpen this corner, and then we can get rid of these edges here and clean this up. Same over here. And in this corner here, what I'll do is I'll move this point over a little bit, and let's dissolve this edge and this edge for now, and we can make a cut from this point to this one, from this one to this one, which means we can dissolve this edge, and that leaves this n-gon over here. And the cleanest way to get rid of that is by selecting these edges here. So I've made a ring selection, and I'm going to deselect these edges here, and then use edge cut with 1 subdivision. So if I subdivide this, we're getting a result that looks like this, and I think that's looking pretty good. The last detail we're going to add is this extrusion here on the side. And because it's basically a round shape, we can start with a cylinder. So let's add one, and I'm going to move this over to about here and rotate it a bit. Let's go ahead and scale this down. Let's check the radius. So I think a radius of maybe 15 should do the trick. Let's make this invisible and select our, let's call this platform. So with my platform selected, I'm going to select a couple of polygons. Where I want to put this extrusion on the side. And I'm going to select all of these polygons here. But actually, before I do, let's go to edge mode. I want to create a more even polygon grid here. So I'm going to select these edges. And dissolve them, and then I'm going to select these edges here and use edge cut with 4 subdivisions. Let's go ahead and select some of these edges here. I'm going to slide them like so, and we could also slide some of these points here. Maybe let's make a cut like this and just dissolve these edges, and we could do the same thing over here. So if I go back to polygon mode, I still have these polygons selected. So this is the area where I want to put that extrusion. If I do an outline selection here click on this area and go to my Move tool. I'm selecting all the edges surrounding these polygons. And as you can see, we have 18 edges. Now that is a bit of a bummer because my original idea was to create a cylinder and to combine the cylinder with half a sphere. The problem is that the segments a sphere will give us will always be divisible by 4. And that means I can get either 16 edges or 20, but not 18. So how do we solve this problem? One way, I guess, would be to add more edge loops on this side here, which is something I don't want to do. And that means we have to build the cap for the cylinder, or the tip of the cylinder, manually. Now we already know that we want a radius of 15 centimeters and we need 18 edges. So let's go ahead and build that cap. And I'm going to do this in a new file. Let's add a disk. And the only thing I'll change here is the rotation segments now. So let's reduce those to 18. And I'm going to make this disk editable. And then I'm going to delete these points here because we need to build quad topology that will deform nicely once we turn this into a hemisphere. And now we can use the polygon pen tool, hold down the control key, left click and drag to create a couple of polygons like this. And then we can select these edges here and use edge cut with 3 subdivisions to create geometry like this. And now we can use the polygon pen tool again. And now let's use close polygon hole to get rid of these holes. Next I'm going to select the points here at the center. And I'm going to use the brush tool. Let's change that to smooth. And just left click and drag in the viewport. And I'm going to select some of these points here and scale them a bit, just trying to create geometry that is a little more even. It doesn't have to be perfect. So something like this maybe. And now we can try and use a shrink wrap deformer to project this geometry onto a sphere. So I'm going to add a sphere. I'll move it down a bit below our disk object, and with the disk selected I'm going to add a shrink wrap deformer, and the shrink wrap deformer needs the sphere as a target object. Right now our sphere is a little bit too small, that's why we're getting this weird result here. If I select the sphere and increase the radius, and let's make this invisible, we're getting something like this. It doesn't look too good, however, and you can see here in the side view that the bottom edges are all wonky, and that's because we don't have a lot of segments for the sphere. If I increase the segments, I'm getting a much better result, so let's crank this up quite a bit. And I'm also going to increase the radius a bit more until we get something that looks a little bit more spherical. Maybe let's do something like this. So if I use current state to object, I can then select these edges here at the bottom and extrude them down a bit. Maybe scale them up a bit. And let's do, no, let's not actually. Let's see how this looks when we subdivide this. And actually it's not looking too bad. We could also try and use a Spherify deformer, and it should be a child of the disk object, of course. And we can move that shrink wrap deformer down. Let's switch off the Subdivision Surface object. I'm going to move this down to about here. And I'm going to change the radius to 100 by 100. So if I subdivide this, it even looks a little bit better. So I'm going to use current state to object again. Let's delete this one. And I'm going to add a cylinder. Our cylinder needs to have a radius of 15 and 18 segments. And let's make this a little bit shorter. Let's move it down. And we don't need any caps, so I'm going to switch these off. And I'm going to use axis center to put the axis at the bottom of my hemisphere here. Let's scale this down. Let's move it down a little bit further. And let's scale it down a little bit more so that it's very close to the radius of the cylinder. And now I can just manually change the size to 30 by 30 without distorting the object too much in the y-axis. And we can select both of these objects now and turn them into a single object. And let's go ahead and select these edges here. And I'm going to use stitch and sew to connect the geometry. And I'm going to add one more edge loop down here just to make sure the deformation is looking nice. So let's grab the line cut tool. I'm going to switch off visible only. And I'm going to make a straight cut like so. And if we subdivide this, we should get a pretty nice looking result. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use axis center to move the axis to the bottom of this object. And actually I think it's still a bit big, so I'm going to move these edges up a little bit and just use axis center again. So now we can copy our, let's call this extrusion, let's call it cone. I'm going to copy it and paste it to my scene file here. And now we need to move it into position on the side of our platform. So what I'll do next is I'll select the platform, go back to polygon mode, and I'm going to switch on the grid so you can see what's happening. In order to get this object to this surface, I'm going to align the work plane to the selection. And now I can go to polygon mode. I can select my cone and I can use selection to work plane. And now all we need to do is move this up into position where we want it to be, and we can reset the work plane to Y. So you can see the edges are not really matching up. Let's maybe move this up a little further. In order to line these edges up, I'm just going to rotate my cone a little bit. I'm just going to eyeball this. So something like this. I'm going to move this down a little bit. And I'm going to switch off that grid again. And I'm also going to close the polygon hole at the bottom of our cone here. So now we can select the platform and use a bool object. Let's make the cone the second child. And I want high quality. I want to create a single object, and I also want to hide the new edges. So now we can make the bool object editable, rename this to platform, and delete these tags. Now we have to do a bit of cleaning up here. So I'm going to select this n-gon here, hit UY to grow the selection and delete these polygons and optimize the object. Now let's go to point mode and fix all the bad stuff here. Up here we can select these points and just weld them to, I'm getting really close. We should weld all the points to the corners of the hole and not to the edges on the original platform. And that's so we don't change the shape of that hole. And we can also connect these points here and these ones over here. Let's go ahead and weld these points and these ones. Same over here. And we can connect these points here and these ones over here, and then dissolve these edges. Just going to weld these points here. Oh, actually, we should connect these points over here. Let's get rid of this edge. And we can also, well, first of all, let's fix these areas by welding some points here. And now we can connect these points and these ones. Same over here. And now we can dissolve this edge and these two edges here. So as you can see, I'm welding some more points. To clean up the geometry here. And I'm creating the edges that I need in order to turn the bottom of this hole into quads as well. So using the cut tool and connect points edges to create the geometry that I need here. And if I subdivide this, we're getting something that is looking really clean. We have no distortion on this curved surface here. And that's looking pretty good. What I forgot to do is make a copy of our cone. So what I'll do to get my cone object back is I'm going to copy this subdivision surface object, and then using Control Z, I'll just go back to where I added the bool object, and I still have this cone in here, so I can pull this out, delete this subdivision surface object, hit Control V to paste the finished object that I just copied, And now we've got both of these objects here. So with my cone selected, I'm going to just move these edges up a little bit. And we can now select the cone and the platform and use connect objects and delete to turn these into a single object. I'm going to select these two edge loops here and then use stitch and sew to connect the geometry. Let's go to our side view. And the angle on my original object looks a little bit different. That's because I wasn't very accurate when I created that model. So the one we have is actually a little bit better. We can select these edges here and scale them down. Let's also move these up a little bit. Let's say to about here. That looks about right. And now we can select these edges here and just scale them a little bit to turn this into a smooth shape. So let's go ahead and subdivide this. I'll rename this to platform. Let's see how that looks. I think that's looking pretty good. I think we need to optimize. There seems to be something wrong with these points down here. So I'll just try and use optimize, which didn't work. And that's interesting. Oh, I really should get rid of the n-gon down here. So let's select this, delete it. And now if I subdivide, I will get something like this. So let's select these edges here. I'm going to use a solid bevel. I'll make this fairly soft, give it a subdivision or an offset of 3. And if I subdivide this, we get this pretty nice looking result here. Last thing I want to do is select these edges here, and I'm going to add a couple of edge loops here just to spread out the geometry more evenly. And now we have something like this. So we can put this platform in a symmetry object now, and you can see something's wrong with the object axis. That's because our cone, the object axis of our cone, was not 0 in all directions. So I'm going to reset the axis of the object to 0 everywhere here. I'm also going to move it to 0 on the x and y axes to put it at the center of the grid. And now we can put this in the symmetry object, make the symmetry editable. I'm going to put this platform in the Subdivision Surface object, which I'm also going to rename to platform. Let's switch on our shader ball. And it still seems a little bit big. I think I'm just going to scale this down. Not the platform, but the shader ball. Let's do something like this. And if I render this, I get this final result here. So that's the end of this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for watching and take care.